Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to another TAUS webinar. Today we talk about how data changes the translation industry. And rather than diving deep into the technical aspects and questions of data like we did in some of our previous webinars, for example, on the cleaning, anonymization, optimizing your training data, today we really focus on the economic aspect or economic perspective. So it'll be very interesting for any business owners and managers here in the audience that need to know really more about the considerations and consequences of this data-driven industry that we live in at the moment. We've divided the content for today into 7 episodes. I see here it says 8, but it's actually shrink down to 7 because 8 was too much for an hour. So 7 episodes, and we'll be hearing perspectives from the TAUS side, of course, from our own director, Jaap van der Meer, but we've also invited a group of guest speakers from various sides of the industry. I have here all the speakers for today. So today we have 2 CEOs of startups in this new data-driven industry, and I'll ask you both to introduce yourself briefly shortly. And also a director of one of the largest translation bodies in the world. So maybe Jürgen, I can start with you asking for just a bit more info about yourself.
Of course, thanks a lot. So my name is Jürgen Gren, and I'm Director of Resources, which means that I have a handle on HR, on machine translation, on IT, on things like buildings, and on budgets. So a lot of different things which are going on in my directorate, and is indeed a directorate in the world's largest translation service. So I'm responsible for e-translation, which is machine translation of the Commission and the different institutions. We develop our own engines for 24 official languages and a few other EU, non-EU languages. And we make these engines for e-translation available to different institutions, public authorities in the EU, and also to SMEs. And we've been developing machine translation since the mid-70s. I was checking back the date. It was roughly at the same time as the first Star Wars movie came out. So it's been some time, you know. So I will not tell you whether I went to the premiere of this movie or not, but still, it was about at that moment in time. And we've done that from the mid-70s, gone on from rule-based machine translation to statistically based machine translation, and then now on to neuro machine translations. We've been there all along the way. And just to give you a feel for what we are actually dealing with here, we are nowhere near Google Translate and these different players, of course. But for us, it's quite big. We have around 100 million pages translated this year alone. Last year was around 100 million, and this year we've reached the same level just in the first 6 months. This is up from a couple of million when we started with the new systems in the mid-2010. Just very quickly, personal background as well. So my name is, as I said, Jürgen Gren. I used to work for the Vice President Andrus Ansip. I was responsible for the digital single market in his team. So I dealt with things like data economy, copyright, and issues such as this. And before that, I was the head of unit in DG Connect, dealing with the digital agenda, it was called at the time. So that's from me. Thank you so much, Annemai.
Great, thank you. Heather, can you introduce yourself and also tell us a bit more about Language I/O, please?
Sure, thanks, Annemai. So I'm Heather Shoemaker. I have a long history in software internationalization and natural language processing. I've worked for startups in the field as well as large companies. And I am the CEO and co-founder of a language technology company called Language I/O. And what Language I/O does is we enable large companies to use their monolingual customer support agents to support customers via chat and tickets and any e-support channel in any language. So you can basically make your monolingual support agents multilingual using our technology. And we've been focused historically on the customer support space, specifically in e-support. And now we're branching into new areas such as audio and outside of the customer support space, anywhere really that businesses can use our real-time or conversational translation technology.
Great, thank you. And Adam, same question to you, please.
Hi, folks. I'm Adam. I'm the CEO of ModelFront, and ModelFront just catches bad translations. That's all we do, right? And the most interesting use case of this, I would say, and I think most people would agree, is what we call hybrid translation. So sort of safely auto-approving raw MT, right? So that your final document is a mix of post-edited stuff, post-edited segments, and segments that were never seen by a human, but keeping today's PEMT quality. And that idea is not something we invented. Big credit, of course, goes to Dr. Lucia Specia, who was working on this for more than 10 years, now helping Facebook AI research with this. And we're a technology provider, so we see ourselves there to make this something that is accessible to all the other players who aren't Facebook AI research, right? And with the end goal, of course, of making good translation considerably cheaper than it is today. Hopefully that means people will order more. And I guess that's why I'm relevant today.
Great, yeah, certainly you're relevant today. And Jaap, maybe I think our audience, of course, knows you by now, but maybe you can say a few words before I show the audience the 7 episodes that we have in store for them today.
Yes, so I'm Jaap van der Meer, founder, director of TAUS. So indeed, I think most people know me by name at least, and we're really honored to have Heather, Jürgen, and Adam here as speakers on this topic. I'm not as frequent speaker as I used to be in the TAUS webinars, but this today is really my thing. You know, thinking about the economic aspects of this whole revolution in our industry, and to have the director of resources of the largest translation organization in the world talking about the changes at the European Commission, DGT of the European Commission, about that very topic is fantastic. And of course, then, you know, the people who lead the revolution from the startups, you know, that's also fantastic, you know, to have you both here, Heather and Adam. So yes, looking forward to the next 52 minutes. Yeah. Maybe you want to fly over the content briefly, and then we'll dive right into it, or shall I do that? I can just take you through sort of what we cover. I mean, and also the way we want to do it. You know, there are many different ways to kind of angles that you can take on these deep economic changes in our industry, and so we've picked a couple of here and a couple of them here, and then we highlight some questions, and we may be sort of deviating from this a little bit as we go, but first of all, we want to put it in a historical perspective. You know, where do we come from and where are we heading? Then we want to zoom in on so what is that? Does that really mean? If we automate translation, it becomes a zero-cost activity. So really zooming in on the economic aspects there. Then understanding machine translation a little bit better. Is it like a magic box, you know, or what's happening when you start using machine translation? What are the things that you need to think of, you know, from let's say an entrepreneur, is the owner of an LSP, a buyer of translation? What do you need to know more than what they tell you? Normally, the vendors that you talk to. And how do you decide on the best MT engine? You know, what is the best MT engine for you? Then talking a little bit more about data, because there's lots of different data, and data is the key word here. So understanding how data is really being utilized and what kind of data. And then, of course, it's inevitable that we talk about the legal aspects. Yeah, business owners, managers, they have to be versatile. They have to know a little bit about everything, right? The technical aspects and also the legal aspects. So to what extent are you free to use all this data? What are the things to watch out for? And at the very end, we'd like to talk a bit more about the bigger picture. If everything becomes so dependent on data, how do we sort of control our own destiny? Because it feels like there are some data monopolies, as there are in other fields of life, with our social media and everything. The papers are full of that every day. But when it concerns our business, how do we think about that in that context? So how do we break the data monopoly? So that's the final topic of today. I think we could talk an hour about each separate topic. So Anna-Maya is going to watch over our time a little bit. There's limited time for each topic, but stay with us. Maybe we'll do more webinars in the future if you like this discussion.
Yeah, and yeah, before we dive into the first episode here, I just want to tell the audience that I'm pretty sure that you have your own thoughts and ideas about these topics. You're realizing also that data is now becoming more and more important. So if you want to ask questions or share comments or thoughts, use the Q&A function here in the GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar panel, and then we'll try to work these in also throughout the webinar. So I think that's all the logistics and practical arrangements, and then on to you again, Jaap.
Yes, if you can click. And the next one, then you'll see a picture that is too busy actually for a slide, but it comes from a report that TAUS published many years ago, the Translation Technology Landscape report. And by the way, we will provide after the webinar references to a lot of material that we'll be discussing here. It kind of, and for those of you who have lived for a long time in this industry, as I did, I think, I can say I lived through every episode here in this evolution back from the 80s. That people have from time to time changed the way we talk about our profession. It went from translation to localization, and then more fashionable companies started talking about themselves as globalization service companies. And we've added some other labels there in the last decade, calling it integration, and where we are today, convergence, which really speaks to sort of how our mobile devices do everything that we want them to do, from navigating ourselves through the physical world, with calculators, cameras, schedulers. They do everything for us. Plus, they translate for us. So it's all thanks to the web services revolution. It's all a matter of using a simple API, and you connect all the functions, and it does everything for you. So translation is broadly and widely available to the world today, and that's how it became so popular and how it started to grow that much. And despite the fact that each of these decades in the history of our industry has been fascinating and have been really sort of revolutionary in their own way, every time, nothing compares to what is still to happen. And we've put the label on it as singularity. That refers to that moment where machines become better than humans at doing sort of very intellectual stuff, creative stuff, like translation. We've put a sort of a date on it of 2030. Ray Kurzweil, one of the biggest fans of singularity, I think very specifically said, because he's always very accurate or precise, don't know whether he's going to be accurate, but he said 2029, I believe. But some of the machine translation providers, Google and Microsoft, already claimed what they called human parity. for their machine translation output. Google was the first in 2016 for common languages like French and Spanish, and then Microsoft, of course, couldn't stay behind. It's a very severe competition between these two on the machine translation front, as you can imagine. They claimed 18 months later or so human parity on more difficult language like Chinese. And then there was a big sort of academic debate sort of emerging, like, what does that mean, human parity? It's not true, you know, because it's only on a very specific type of content, and it has been tested at scale. It hasn't been evaluated by professional translators. It's just like they do with everything these days, gathering data from maybe not qualified people to tell us the truth about this competition between man and machine. So it's an ongoing debate. But I'd like to ask the panel here their feelings, like about this evolution and where we're at, and how close we are to human parity. Heather, what's your thought on that? Oh, you're muted, I think.
I knew I was going to do that sooner or later.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jaap. This is a fascinating topic, and Language I/O has certainly benefited from the integration and convergence phases. As far as human parity is concerned, like you said, there's been a lot of argument about that in the machine translation world. What we're seeing at Language I/O, where we're very focused on company-specific translations, is that general machine translation is really close, especially for certain languages. I will say for other languages, I'll throw out Thai, Korean. I wouldn't say that we're close to human parity, but for some languages, absolutely, especially when it's just a general machine translation engine that we're talking about. What we see at Language I/O is that when it comes to company-specific translations, humans are very much still needed to be in the loop, not in the traditional TEP, old style human translation sense, but in the feedback loop sense when it comes to ensuring that a model, regardless of how you approach the concept of an NLP model, providing that company or industry specific tuning that is still necessary, definitely not human parity, whereas a human would just know the context and be able to immediately switch streams from a general to a company or industry specific conversation. Machines aren't there yet. There's still a lot of work involved in that process, and I'm sure both Jürgen and Adam know what I'm talking about and can comment on that as well.
Yeah, Adam, I guess, you hope that human parity will be very far out in the future, because if it's here, then you're out of business, because you said your business is, detecting the bad translations, and, with human parity, there is no bad translation, right? So what's your feeling on this?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. If I thought that human parity were coming soon, I'm either, I'm a liar here if I say not, or I'm an idiot for starting this business, right?
Yeah.
There's this Paul Graham quote that I like, and it just applies to all NLP systems, and I like the way that Heather also kind of, just talk about NLP in general here, is that the more interesting your message, the less your autocorrect on your phone helps you, right? Like if we were gonna, I don't know, translate, let's say, the description of this webinar with some generic engine, maybe it would get everything right, but then the word TAUS, like for Yazidis, is like the pigeon, the peacock god, for example, right? And then TAUS gets translated as fazan or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, it was 99% correct, but it was kind of the most important word about the whole thing, is exactly where it tends to mess up. So in that sense, I think that we're very far off, and it also reminds me of when I was just an intern at Adobe. What our boss used to say is that that he had this fear that we would just always take the easiest bugs, and that like after 10 years we would be left with just the very, very hardest ones that like nobody could figure out how to fix. And that's really where we're going, which is an improvement, but let's be realistic. That last 10% or whatever is impossible.
Yeah, interesting. And Jürgen, at the DGT, do you measure this gap, of human parity? Or do you have any sort of insight in that?
Well, I mean, I would agree with all the former speakers, with Heather and Adam, to say that, of course, we are not close to human parity. I mean, the e-translation is an excellent system, I have to say, but we are not at human parity just yet, and I don't think we will ever get there for a variety of reasons. But that's also the second point, but which we will come to, I'm sure. But to answer your question on whether we measure this, well, what we do is that we are a part of what is called the WMT, which is kind of the workshop for machine translation. It's kind of an Olympics for machine translation systems, and we compete there and try to place ourselves vis-a-vis the other types of system which are out there in the world. Most of them are competing here, and we usually place ourselves pretty well there. But I would say that when they measure, because they always measure also towards human translation in that competition. And what is found is that human translation is usually better than machine translation. Only in one case was machine translation better than the human translation, and that was from English into Russian, I think. But it depends, of course, on the translator. But it's usually better, and is usually quite far ahead. So human parity, I wouldn't say that we are there yet, and I would actually argue that it's not actually needed as a concept or a notion, to be quite frank. I mean, this is a tool which is there to help translators and to help in certain areas to translate a certain number of things, which are of course huge when it comes to volume, but it's not the same thing. So I'm not entirely sure that this concept is so much needed, to be quite frank. Maybe I'm a little bit too controversial here. I don't know.
No, I think this is a fantastic wisdom that you're sharing so early in the webinar already, and we should take note of that. That's a very good point. Yeah. Let's move on to the next episode here. And so, yeah, I mean, the first was putting it in historical perspective. We're on a journey to automating the process of translation. It's fascinating. But and the convergence that I mentioned there, as you know, where we are today, has invited a lot of innovators, and we call them invaders. You know, they are insider innovators and they're invader innovators, and the invaders are the worst, you know, because they have no history, they have no legacy with translation, and they just come in and make everything look so easy on our phones, you know. But that what this picture tries to illustrate is here how that starts to clash with what we can now consider to be kind of a luxury industry, the professional translation industry, serving only a limited number of customers if you compare it to the 6 billion or 7 billion consumers out there who all access translation on their devices. You know, there are people who pay for every word that gets translated. So that's immediately illustrating this whole concept of zero cost translation. How is that even possible? Well, there we refer to, if you really like economics and want to study this a little further, then we refer to Jeremy Rifkin, who wrote books about zero marginal cost. And what he really argues there is that you eliminate the variable cost. You know, so there is no marginal extra cost in producing a new translation. So what the big tech companies have been after for more than 50 years is to build that magic machine that can translate any piece of information on the planet into any other language. And it's been a long journey of trial and error, and it seems like now we're getting there. Well, with the limitations that we just highlighted. But the point is here that there is no additional variable cost in producing more translations once you have built the machine. So that's what's fascinating about it. But in our industry, the way we've measured sort of our success in localization is traditionally done by how good is the translation. Our pride is in how good is the quality of our translation. And that's another thing that seems to be changing. We hear a lot more people talk about what's the global impact of this localization. How do we measure sort of the customer success, customer wins, the reduction in our customer support costs, for instance, in Heather's business model, when you focus on customer support. So this change from a variable cost to a zero marginal cost to having an infrastructure that translates for free, just like music is free, information is free these days, has a big impact on the way we measure our business as well in the localization industry. So until maybe only about 2 years ago, machine translation and human translation were two parallel universes. Even at Google and Microsoft, the localization departments were not using the machine translation engines yet. Not so many people are aware of that, but only since a year or two, 3 maybe, we don't know exactly, they started using their machine translation engines in the localization departments at Microsoft and Google. So this is the point here. This is what it's all about. How sustainable is the business model that many of us still rely on, our economic model in our industry? How sustainable is it to keep alive this sort of very heavy cascaded supply chain where every word costs money because it's touched by somebody or several people in our supply chain? So this process of creative destruction that is famous for the revolution of the .com age. Some of you may remember that, when e-commerce became sort of really a threat to the old businesses. So that's really very actual for our industry now. This creative destruction. Do we start destroying our own business to survive? That's the question. So what do we do? Are we going to start building our own MT engines, or are we making moves sideways to provide other types of services, data services, cultural training? If we're in the localization business, we know different cultures. Maybe we can use our talents and skills in a different way. Are we moving upstream, sort of upside, and provide transcreation service, as many people do? Or are we going to provide data services? These are very fundamental questions. So, I'd like to open this up for a quick round of sort of thoughts or reflections. Adam, what do you think of this this threat to the very sort of economic model of our industry?
I haven't been following the translation industry, the real translation industry, for very long, because as you said, a few years ago, the machine translation side of things was so separate, right? I didn't know what a TMS was when I started Modelfront.
Yeah.
Right? And as I see it, back then I was, one of the first jobs I had was maintaining that Google Chrome, Google Translate integration, right? And which then launched on Android. Now there's about 3 billion people or more who have it. And you imagine just every time one of those people opens a website that's not in their language, which is most of the web for them, 99% of it, it translates. So imagine how many characters are going through there. However, the willingness to pay for it is very, very, very low. And so I would argue that what we're talking about, what we've just described, has already happened and happened 10 years ago, and that just, the vast majority of the machine translated content just never touches what we think of as the translation industry. They don't know what TAUS is, they don't know what line bridge is, right? And that has already happened. And what does come to the translation industry is all the valuable content, the stuff that somebody is willing to pay 5 cents a word for. And I would argue that the people who are willing to pay so much, I mean, it is really expensive once you have any significant size of content. The people who are willing to pay so much, they don't really want zero cost for that content. Yeah. They'd rather pay a little bit more to have some assurance you know, that the final touches are going to be right. So we at Modelfront see the future for this industry, like these valuable content, and maybe a little bit below that will become more doable as hybrid translation. And of course, there will always be that top tier where no machines are involved, or where there's it's full PEMT, and so it's just this spectrum, and this has already happened. And so if we're still here now, we survived.
Good. That's very encouraging. Jürgen, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, a part of this discussion was also about whether machine translation will replace human translation. Yeah. This is a part of the discussion as well. But I would say I've been in quite a few different discussions with translators, and now lately in the Translating Europe Forum not so long ago, and we discussed there a little bit on what the outlook is from translators. I mean, do they fear the future, as it were? And I think what Adam said is completely true. They do not, generally speaking, fear the future. They see that this added value content is where they have their niche, and where demand is still growing, and is growing very fast. The whole demand of translation is growing enormously in the world. And from the European Commission side, I would say that we have a sort of a policy goal of forwarding multilingualism. This is, of course, a really key and essential feature of the European Union as such. And what is the best way to forward multilingualism on the Europa site, on other sites as well, where, as Adam very rightly said, most of the time it's in a language we don't speak? Yeah, of course, it's machine translation. So I would say that the complementarity between machine translation and human translation is absolutely key. I mean, you have certain texts, as you said, legal text, contracts, or artistry, like a novel, for instance. All of these things need our added value and truly need a human touch to progress. But of course, this also means that there is a certain evolution in the profession, obviously. I mean, it's not necessarily well known outside, at least maybe not in the Commission, that translators are indeed IT and data professionals. This may not be well known. Okay, it's getting more known today, obviously, because of machine translation, Google Translate, etc. But this is not necessarily well known, and this is actually the case. But it evolves the profession. So you have, of course, the accuracy checks, maybe a big discussion about post-editing, whether this is sort of the new dimension, generally speaking, for translators, or light post-editing. All of this discussion we also have internally in Commission. But I know for a fact that this is a part of big discussions in the translation profession. But just to say, for me, this is clearly a complementarity, is not a replacement. And I go back to what I said in the beginning. You called it wisdom. That's a very kind word. I was just throwing it out there to see if I can get some discussion going. But okay, wisdom, I take that. And just to say on the point that you made as well, Jap, on the zero marginal cost, I mean, this is an incredible evolution. Truly, this is incredible. Although I have to say, being also the responsible for budget, it is not entirely free. No. Servers and cloud is not entirely free. So, you know, zero marginal cost for one extra translation, yes, more or less, but the upfront investment is usually quite high.
Absolutely, yeah. And we could have a whole different webinar or course on, you know, all these economic aspects as well. We can't cover all of that, but that's true. Yeah. All right, yeah, thank you. Let's indeed, for the sake of time, move on, because there is this thing. So, you know, we have no fear. We're very excited about the future. It's not going to replace the humans, but we need to understand better what this machine translation box is really about. Is it a magic box, or what's happening inside? And I think that's something that a lot of people have misperceptions about. We always said at TAUS conferences, you know, it's or we asked the question rather from machine translation gurus from the big tech companies, like, in our understanding, machine translation is a simple sum of algorithms and data. which one of the two is more important, the algorithms or the data? And then consistently, people would say, we think data is more important. And if you really want to find out a little bit more, we recommend that you click to Hugging Face and look at this a 1 hour kind of video with Clément Delange, very appropriate name, who talks about all of these parameters that you can switch on and off in these very, very big models, you know, to try to get better output from the engines. And somewhere sort of, you know, in a quarter into his tutorial, he says, but, and he sighs like, you know, whatever we do, we're finding that, you know, we cannot outsmart the data. Data is always helping to create better output. More data always outperforms the smarter model. So it's interesting to discover that again and again, that data is the key differentiator in the machine translation business. And then if you think about it, so there's and then I'll get to the question here, but NLP, natural language processing, is at the core of everything we do, and not just in the machine translation space pure sang, but also in many of the surrounding kind of activities. You know, you think about any kind of business, and it's usually, you know, the process can be reduced to some form of text comes in, and there is some process and manipulation, and something else comes out, and it may be speech or text. So the power of the data and the natural language processing is behind many different functions. You know, text summarization, sentiment analysis, the question answering, the chatbots, and it's kind of opening up lots of new opportunities for the entrepreneurs in the language business. And I think, you know, Adam and Heather are good examples of that, who start new businesses with completely new ideas and directions to leverage sort of our knowledge and the technology that is evolving. Yeah, maybe some reflections on that, Heather, from your side.
Thanks, Jaap. So yeah, this is a super interesting topic. And I think in your paper, the title is No Data, No Future, What's More Important, Data or Algorithms, et cetera. And, you know, at Language.io, our approach has been to let the tech giants kind of grapple with the data issue, especially today with GDPR, all of the privacy constraints associated with data. And in the Language.io industry or space, which is customer support and conversational content or UGC content specifically, privacy is huge, right? We can't hold on to that data for training purposes. So what our approach has been, and I know that there's an argument out there that data is always more important than algorithms, but because we are unable to hold on to the conversational content that we're translating for privacy reasons, again, we've let the tech giants and the folks focused on the NMT technology worry about the general translation, the fluency of the translation, improving the fluency of the translation with data. And we've really focused on tuning our algorithms and models and learning mechanisms and feedback loops so that we can use much smaller quantities of data to tune our process and provide company-specific accurate translations. It's a tough dilemma to be faced with, for sure. But again, in today's climate where privacy legislation is blooming anew in every country, it feels like every week, it's reality. And I think this constraint has also created opportunity for entrepreneurs like myself and Adam, who are, you know, coming face on at this challenge and coming up with new ways to tackle it, new ways to improve translation quality and fluency without very much data. So I'd love to hear what Adam and Jürgen feel about this as well.
Yeah. Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would consider Heather's challenges, I mean, we talk sometimes, it's an extreme scenario, right? It's extremely difficult, you know, to make things work. So data can be kind of a luxury, right? I see it as, yeah, you can always improve the algorithms, right? But once you have your data set that you collected or didn't collect, you can't really do very much later. You can clean it, but you can't really add to it later. So, um, so to the question of what's important, I mean, when you're building a system or building a company, they're all important. In fact, that, data, algorithms, and a lot of other things all have to be lined up. But the algorithms, you can always swap in better ones later, right? Which we all do. But if you're not saving your data now, you're going to have problems later. So, and I would say that data is not fungible, right? So like this data from this one workflow or one company doesn't actually help that much with this other workflow or other company because of subtle differences, shift, etc. So it's not just like, wheat or something or pork bellies, which you can have on a futures market. So yeah, and so, this is about economics, right? So we can talk about
exactly.
fungibility and so on, right? So I would say to everybody, I wish this were sort of understood, but it's not, right? Which is save your data from your workflows.
Yeah.
You never know when you're going to need it, and
Absolutely.
it's not that hard to save. Then with regard to choosing a MT solution, we see accuracy as a function of many things, right? Which is what input you're giving it, what you have trained it on, how you're measuring accuracy, and so on. So you can't just say like, Microsoft is 64 and Google 72 or something like that, right? DeepL. So it's as a function of some inputs which are very specific to every single scenario, language, content type, and so on. How much training data have you done? And that's why, I mean, if you look at modelfront.com/compare was sort of our answer to this question, right? Many people ask us, and which machine translation API should we use? And we don't put like some accuracy ranking or something like that, but it's just about features, right? Like, does it have customization? Does it have glossary? Does it allow customization from German to French?
Yeah.
Right? Google and Microsoft don't support that. You can only customize to and from English.
Yeah.
Right? DeepL doesn't, really have customization at all in their API. And then the, locales, right? And this is again where all your linguistic knowledge comes in, right? And those are the make or break things. It's like, it doesn't really matter if one is 1 point better than the other. I just can't use this if it doesn't support customization on this language pair, because customization always wins for this scenario or whatever. So features, I think, are the way to pick an MT solution.
I think that's a very good point. But what I find interesting is that among the TMS or GMS systems, the translation platforms, there seems to be sort of a competition on who has the most MT engines connected through their APIs. And I've been wondering sort of, why? I mean, what's the use of having so many MT engines connected to your workflow system? Because how do you then choose which one to use? It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. What do you think of that, Adam?
I suppose there was, I guess there's a question of what a TMS exists for, right? And what Gabor Ugrai said to me, which I think it made a lot of sense to me. I didn't understand this at first, is like, it's for turning a document into segments, first and foremost. Okay, the rest, like how you deal with multiple translators and all of that, it's also important, but like at its core, it's from going from a document to something that you can, run against the TM and run against machine translation and so on. And from that sense, being integrated to as many APIs as possible is kind of their thing. And by the same token, they don't seem to have a strong interest in, let's say, having their own machine translation. So because those things are always upgrading and innovating, and it's really a tough race, right? In this for the accuracy and so on. And so the way they handle that is with just doing integration really on the request of their customers. And are they going to lose a customer over 10 lines of code? You know.
Yeah.
So just from I'm really an outsider on this, but that
Sure.
seems to be my observation, that they at the end they'll always do what their customer wants.
Yeah. Well, as we said, each topic, each question here could be a webinar on its own of an hour. But let me just maybe quickly also raise that point, because the state of the art right now in the industry seems to be real-time adaptive neural machine translation, and that's provided by some of the innovators, and I think, Heather, you do that too at Language.io. And then companies like Lilt, of course, was probably the first, and then Unbabel and Translated, and now Lengu from Berlin, they're doing it. But it's kind of a lock-in model for an average LSP. That's probably not the solution. It's nice for some of the customers, but they will be locked into that service model. It's software as a service. So anyone who wants to have more control and do more customization for themselves will have to start building their own infrastructure and engines, and that's what obviously the European Commission DGT is doing, and it remains very interesting to see how many will go down that road eventually. But anyway, that's still early days. I don't know if there are any thoughts on that particular notion from you. Otherwise, we'll move on.
I would just get in here. They don't pay me enough, the modern MT guys, translated guys, but like, I mean, if you look at it, modern MT kind of gives you that, right?
Yeah.
A kind of off-the-shelf offering, and you just throw in your TM and,
okay. Yeah.
And so as long as you're also keeping your TM, you're not too locked in my book.
Yeah.
So very cool piece of technology.
True. Yeah, that's true. We're partners of Translated in the Data Marketplace project at TAUS, so we know them very well. All right. Yeah. So this is just a picture of what we think everybody should be aware of. When you go down this route yourself of training engines, then you have to pay attention to the data, and data preparation is not usually simply a matter of uploading your translation memories. Your translation memories are not of the same sort of the right shape for machine translation training right away. There's a lot of work to be done on your data in terms of cleaning, clustering, anonymization, what have you. Train and measure, and then that's a continuous cycle. It's a diligent data pipeline that you have to build up there, that is something new for our industry as well. Yeah, we've covered that, and I'm looking at the clock that is ticking. So let's just zoom in on a bit further on this topic of data. And if you show the next slide, that also refers to an old TAUS report where we kind of came up with this whole concept of the modern translation pipeline with data feedback loops. And this is the point we mentioned earlier, that the KPIs in our industry are changing from linguistic quality to global impact. So and people want to measure global impact. So we are distinguishing two types of data. The language data is the data that's being used to train the engine. So that's the source and target content. But then there is all this data about translation, we call translation data, that can eventually help you to measure global impact, for instance, and to do things like resource allocation, content profiling, optimizing the whole workflow. So that's another important aspect to think about as managers in our industry, that not all data is the same, and there's a lot to manage there in this diligent data pipeline. Any thoughts from you, Jürgen, on I mean, you manage an enormous amount of data, of course, under your responsibility, and how do you, yes, let's skip that on the mind. Yeah. How do you differentiate the data? How do you utilize the data in an optimal way? Do you want to have some thoughts on that? Share some thoughts on that?
We just maybe share some thoughts on data more generally speaking. I mean, we're very lucky in the European Union because we have, as I said in the beginning, we've started with machine translation and collecting language memories from the 70s, basically. We're very lucky. So which means that we were endowed, if you will, with an immense data lake called EURAMES. That is around 1.5 billion segments. Part of it is public, and you can actually access it over the EU Science Hub. Not all of it is publicly available because we have interinstitutional issues with sharing all of the data, and it goes back to a little bit what Heather said as well about privacy, GDPR issues, and things like this, and the anonymization and the and the need to clean it up before we can make it available. But part of it is available, and this is the strength that we have. I mean, every night basically we have our translators producing the translations, and we have the EURAMES being enriched with 100 to 200,000 segments every night. And this is vetted data. This is good, high quality translated data. So these, I mean, this is a huge richness for us, and we build our own engines based on this. So we have updates of our own engines every 6 months, something like this. Each engine that we have is basically done with about 50 to 80 million segments. This is how we do our different engines. The new thing for us, and I will just 2 points, and then I'm also aware of the time, but 2 points. Where we are moving into now from our side is domain-specific engines. We're doing it for different institutional partners, but this is also where data comes in. This is where it becomes a little bit more tricky. Right now we are mining EURAMES for this, but it is slightly tricky, and we need quite a few data sets, specific data sets from our partners to be able to do these different domain-specific engines. So we still have issues with data, as Adam also said, most of us have. But I would say one new challenge, which is also perhaps interesting for the people listening to this to note, is to get access to public language data from the different member states here in the EU. Because usually they don't have central depositories. Usually this is about individual translators having personal language memories on their PCs. But in all, they have bad data, as it were. This is not vetted data. It's perhaps in PDF format. So we have a big problem in getting the member states to share data depositories or to share data with us, generally speaking, so that we can improve the engines that we are working with, but also more generally, of course, for the rest of the European Union, at least, and the companies working here. So I would give you a little tip, a lobbying tip. So, which comes from, I'm not entirely sure that my colleagues in DD Connect would enjoy this, but one of the things which I was working with when I did Digital Single Market was the PSI, Public Sector Information Directive. Okay, and in the Public Sector Information Directive, there is a list which is updated every year about data sets which should be made available by member states publicly and freely. So this could be business registration data, weather data, that kind of stuff, to encourage for small companies to use these kind of data. Now, language data is not currently a part of that list, but maybe with the help of the industry, it could be. So that was my little tip for today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great tip. All right. Yeah. Again, we could go on and talk a lot more about all the work that's required on our language data to bring them into top condition for MT training, but we wanted to also cover this legal aspect of data, access to data, and in this regard, we refer to a white paper that TAUS has published together with Baker McKenzie, our legal advisors, and where we cover, I think, pretty much all aspects of the language data and the translation data who owns what, and this picture illustrates that a little bit. Of course, there is copyright on data, IP on source and target. There is database rights, on the tools, and there is now, of course, PII, the GDPR in Europe, regulations that we need to all be aware of. So it's a minefield, and it makes people in general kind of very kind of afraid almost to touch anything there, which is really a pity. It's a shame. And so again, there we like to refer to our white paper. But if we click through, then you see some examples of individual segments, and you recognize the first one as from the lyrics of Don McLean's song. That's a very creative sentence, and there may be copyright on that. But the next sentence from the same song is quite generic and could easily be copied and used by anyone. So it's kind of what the essence of the whole white paper, let me say that, is that it comes in the end down to sort of the common sense of the operators, of the users, the translators, the managers in our business. Are you at risk using this data, using this content, to train your engines? The good thing is that, Jürgen, and you must be very aware of that in Europe we have something similar to the fair use ruling that has for a long time put the US-based big tech companies at an advantage, because they could use any data for research purposes, and everything was a research purpose, of course. But now in Europe we have something similar, isn't that right? Or do you have something to say about that?
Yes, it is very much right, and I was working on this, helping any which way I could to with the lawyers. We wrote this new text and data mining clause into the copyright rules. Yeah. Now, what happens there is something very important. You can do it with scientific research. It's kind of a fair use of scientific research, but we also expanded it to any entity. So companies, whoever, can actually do text and data mining, and then for this purpose of this discussion, use it to create language engines, machine translation engines. Yeah. The thing is, it needs to be not specifically opted out from the right holders. That is the only thing. So if it's behind a paywall, for instance, then to do the web crawling, that it makes it much more difficult and impossible. So that if the right holder opts out for this specifically and actively, then you cannot do the web crawling, for instance. Yeah. So this is something which is very interesting. I mean, the owning data, who owns my language data, was the question in this little section. So I mean, this is largely about permissions, or, as we said, the text and data mining type of exceptions. I don't want to go into GDPR because that's very technical, and I'm by no means an expert in this, but it is a shield to control personal data. And indeed, you need to be, shall we say, a little bit on top of this, to have the different rules on data collection, purpose, duration, sharing, etc., that you understand how it works for your company. And this is not necessarily so easy, but it's a part of our key in the European Union right now. And most countries across the world are actually copying this legislation. Yeah. So it is definitely worth knowing about, put it that way.
Absolutely, yeah. So the rules are changing and give us a bit more room to use data. But again, this is a big topic, and we refer to a white paper, and happy to try to answer any questions that come up. And the final topic is too big for 1 minute, but it's a very interesting question, and I'm almost ready to promise another webinar on this very topic. But the question that we had a prep call with Heather, Jürgen, and Adam, and we talked about this, like, are we entering a new phase in the economic evolution overall, like a more cooperative sort of sharing economy. There's a lot of talk about that in the newspapers, and how would that possibly affect our industry? And at TAUS, we are a big a proponent of that. We're working on a data marketplace where everybody could share data, trade data, monetize data. So how do we imagine the new economic models that may be emerging from this AI revolution? Heather, I'd like to ask you to maybe share a final thought on that, if you can keep it very short, because we're right at the end of the hour.
Yeah, I'll do my very best, but I think you're absolutely right, Jaap. The industry is evolving, and how we place value on our services is changing very drastically. I read in the Forbes report, I'm sorry, the Gartner report that you linked to, that, and maybe it was even in your report, that we're going to have to go away from this cost per word model. And at Language.io, we've already done that, right? The way that we charge for our service is changing drastically. It's really, what value are we adding on top of the machine translation in many cases, even for human translation, how we add value and how we charge and place value on our services is evolving. So that's all I've got time for.
Yeah. And ladies and gentlemen on the MAI, I think we have come to the end, and we realize now that we've been overly ambitious with our agenda. Nevertheless, I think it was a very interesting exchange here, and we're very proud again that we had such great speakers here. Heather, Adam, Jürgen, thanks so much for joining us, and we may call on you again to join us for another webinar to dive deeper into some of these topics. To our audience, we're sorry that we've taken a bit more time. The recording will be shared. We will be sharing some links to materials that we were referring to, and we keep you informed that all your questions, if you ask them, will be answered. Just let us know, and we'll be back in touch. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.